Right. So first of all, Jose Carlos, welcome to the Metaforum. It's a real honor and privilege to have you with us. As I was saying before, this is very exciting for our community because the little I know about what you are going to talk to us, this is a project that not many of us have heard about that started in Peru. I understand your father was one of the protagonists of this project. And it happened about the same time that that Stafford was doing the CyberSyn project in Chile. So really, really interesting to hear from you, and welcome to the Metaforum. So it's all yours. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and we are all listening.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my father was not involved in this, even though he was also engaged with other topics on science. But I mean, I'm a researcher. I'm a writer, a curator, and I work in different areas around technology, science, society, art and technology for nearly 3 decades, mostly in Peru and Latin America, but also in the UK where I'm based. And I mean, I work in topics around the archaeology of media, the history of art and technology. And recently, I also been working quite a bit on the history of cybernetics in Latin America. I founded an organization in Peru called Alta Tecnología Andina, which has been working for also nearly 30 years now, around projects in art, science, and technology. I'm also lecturing at Luis in Rome, and I'm a senior research fellow at the London School of Economics, where I did my master's and PhD studies in information systems. So I even though I work in culture, my background is in science and technology, I would say. So first of all, I would like to thank the Metaforum community, and in particular, Angela. Thank you for inviting me for this presentation. And I would like to tell first a little story, a small story of how this research came about, which maybe seem as a sequel of fortunate events. I mean, 3-4 years ago, I started this idea of setting a call for proposals for a special issue on cybernetics in Latin America, along with my colleagues David Molen and Ignacio Nieto. We thought it was important to work on this idea of a special issue for this journal AI and Society, because there is a history of cybernetics in Latin America, but perhaps not very well known. So we thought it was the appropriate moment, and I would say that the aim was to build not just the past, but also the present history of cybernetics in Latin America. And I would say that we received lots of contributions, but a particular contribution struck me. And it was the contribution of Carlos Sena, who is also present here, which was an homage to exceptional people, to Oscar Barsabsky. I'll talk a little bit later about him. He was also an homage to Stefano Varese, to Mario Pedrosa, to Stafford Beer, and to Umberto Maturana. It was a presentation about certain ideas which were very much connected to culture, also to cybernetics, to original ways of thinking in from Latin America, but in particular about this project that struck me, and I'm gonna talk about a little bit more. So it was this project in Peru, which was aimed to build a mathematical model to think about the country in a very particular time. And it was the first time I heard of it. That's why I was very struck about this. And after that, I read a book by Stefano Varese. Stefano Varese is a prominent anthropologist, a social scientist, working in the UC Davis, University of California. And in this book, which are his memoirs, he also talks about this place, the Centro, and he also mentioned some of the people that I'm going to talk about. So this was my second stop of something that I didn't knew about. So I thought I had to go and take a look at how to work a little bit more on this research. So I went to Brazil, where there is the archive.
Estoy en una reunión, Seba.
Do you hear? Yeah, there is a problem? No. I heard some comment. Oh, okay. So what I went to the Memorial Daci Ribeiro, where these archives of this project that I'm going to talk about are. But also I went to Rio de Janeiro. I met Carlos Sena, who once more has been a guiding agent of this project. And so I want to warn you all that this is an ongoing research and that some of this information is still preliminary as I work on how this project connects to many of the elements of the history of cybernetics and computation in Latin America. Therefore, the idea of bringing this research to the Metaforum community is also for me an opportunity to receive some valuable feedback. So I would start with this, and to understand the creation of Centro, which is what I'm going to talk about, I need to give a little bit of context. And the first context that I need to bring is to consider the importance and the influence of its founder and director, the anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro from Brazil. Actually, we are commemorating the centenary of his birth. And actually, we're also commemorating the 50th anniversary of the creation of this project of Centro this year. So Darcy was not only a social scientist, he was actually very much engaged in public administration, in politics. He became the first rector of the University of Brasilia. He also served the President Goulart as a Minister of Education first, and then as head of the cabinet, of chief of staff. And in 1964, after the military coup that deposed Goulart, Ribeiro went into exile, first in Uruguay, where he worked as a professor of anthropology and as a planning advisor for the University of the Republic. And in Uruguay, Darcy Ribeiro not only developed a significant intellectual work, but also recognized himself as Latin American. He started to think about Latin America, broadly speaking. And in September 68, he returned to Brazil, but he was arrested. He spent 9 months in a pretrial detention. Half of that time, he was held in a prison in Santa Cruz Fortress, then in another one in Las Cobras. After being tried by a military tribunal, he was declared a person of maximum danger. So he was he acquainted for lack of evidence, but however, he was forced into exile. So he went to Caracas, and there at the University of the Central University of Venezuela in Caracas, he worked on. I mean, he was a place where he started to encounter the mathematical models. Then he went to Chile. He worked with Salvador Allende and also with the university, and then to Peru. But I'm gonna focus a little bit more about that in a moment. The other person that I want to bring into this discussion is an Argentine mathematician, Oscar Barsavsky, who developed a research in mathematical modeling applied to developments, what he called as development styles, so which had a particular autonomy in the analysis of Latin American problems. So he wrote a seminal book on scientific practice and how science was determined by the needs of the established academic system, the Western system, let's say, and while in a way what science should be determined was by a will to change society, in particular the local context. So Barsavsky he carried out some of his pioneering research in the Central University of Venezuela at the Centro de Estudios para el Desarrollo, CENDES, And Barsavsky was really interested in developing methods of numerical experimentation applied to Latin American social and economic reality, using scenarios, future scenarios based on a large number of related variables that allowed the calculation of material and political viabilities of alternative development styles. That's how he called them, development styles. So the idea of the model was to bring a sort of an image or a representation of a system, which not only included the characteristics and the attributes, but also the relationships and the connections. And the models were not aimed also at generating a projection, but were enabled to facilitate logical deductive reasoning and producing some kind of descriptions and explanations that could build a more creative idea of a society. So he aimed to promote the development of human creativity, of science, of technological autonomy, and the satisfaction of basic needs for greater majorities. And these type of numerical simulation projects or computational models were called for him. There were ways of analyzing through different variables the development of policies that he called national projects. Darcy Ribeiro, his first approach to mathematical modeling came actually in Caracas. He was, as I already mentioned, Sendes was developing these methods of numerical experimentation applied to Latin American reality, mostly models related to Venezuela. But in this context, both Barsavsky and Darcy carried a project for a computational model of social change for Brazil. And the project did not aim to predict the future evolution of the system under analysis using historical data, in this case, data from Rio de Janeiro, but rather it wanted to establish a model that would allow, through the computational processes, to analyze the consequences that were nourished by a set of hypotheses on the characteristics, the behavior of the population under study. And in other words, it was a constructive model, a heuristic model building on certain data. And the variables included not only population, but also organizations, maps of relations between actors, the type of governments, education, foreign relations, policies, income. And these variables were applied to 3 experiments, in this case, to a status quo experiment, which consisted of letting the program run without introducing exogenous changes, a Spartacus model, which tried to see the fate of a conflict provoked by an increase in the power of certain unions or trade unions and oppositions, but also a nationalist military experiment, which where the influences of nationalist actors within the government were increased. The kind of experiment developed were exciting for a social scientist like Barsavsky, like Darcy Ribeiro. So these numerical experimentations allowed the elaboration of forms of viable, of what Darcy called viable utopias for Latin America. That is not necessarily an utopic model, but a viable process, a creative process through which we can search for the satisfaction of the needs of the majorities. And moreover, in the early 70s, it was seen that the socialist governments of Peru and Chile could carry out these novel national projects, which encompassed a set of objectives to which the classes or social sectors that have directly or indirectly usually were not involved could take control of their future. So that was more or less the idea, that these projects also could enable or make people exercise power, and therefore enable them to have the capacity to implement those initiatives. In a wider context, and I think this is also important to mention, there was a use of mathematical modeling throughout the 60s and 70s. The best known was a report, The Limits of Growth, by the MIT and the Club of Rome, which was based on a large data set of mathematical models and computer simulation, and it was objective. It objectively demonstrated that if development continued in the current pattern, there would be an inevitable planetary catastrophe. That's what they said. And the report recommendation was to halt economic and population growth with the aim of achieving a sort of equilibrium. But it was quite unrealistic, not just because, I mean, politics, there are lots of variables that were not taken into account, but also because that made that and the developed countries, let's say developed countries maintain their welfare levels, but the underdeveloped countries remain balanced, which means that they will continue in a state of misery, which went against any welfare policy and had, it was actually quite a very objective model, but with no application to reality. And there was this foundation in Argentina, the Bariloche Foundation, which was founded in 1963, which was a very particular foundation. It consolidated several departments, offered up multidisciplinary approaches, and in response to that report from the MIT, they proposed an alternative with quite a different approach. It was called the Latin American World Model, Modelo Mundial Latinoamericano. And it was directed by a geologist, Amilcar Herrera, which took a critical look at the MIT model, and they presented an alternative, a disruptive and an emancipatory proposal that sought to solve inequality on a global scale. And this proposal asserted that physical limits were mainly due to social and political aspects. Some technical observations were also present. Here, they highlighted the weakness of the scientific basis of the MIT model, and this Latin American world model questioned some of the variables that suppose socio-political and the socioeconomic indicators used in the model, which were quite disconnected, as I mentioned before, from the reality of many countries. So from a socio-political point of view, presenting a model with perfect stability was unfeasible. The central point, therefore, from this Latin American world model was that the underdeveloped societies could not emerge from the backward state if they allow the same patterns or the same policies of development than the industrialized countries. So there was an ideology proposed by this model that tend to prompt us to rethink the consumerist model of industrialized countries towards a model that promotes the development of material and cultural goods, but allowing people to develop fully as human beings without wasting resources. We have to think that this was thought 50 years ago, so it was quite pioneering and novel. In other words, it was an original proposal from Latin America that sought to imagine a possible future based on an egalitarian world, questioning this kind of developmentalist approach or paradigm and proposing a more interdisciplinary and global approach. This team, as I mentioned, was led by Amilcar Herrera and Hugo Skolnick, who worked on the model between 72 and 74 and create this alternative model. It was, the computer center at the Fundación Bariloche had state-of-the-art machines that were fundamental for this purpose. And at the end, after some years, this model was presented in 1974. It was presented, I just wanted to mention. It's interesting. I just want to focus on this phrase from an article from William Nordhaus, who says the most fascinating aspect of the Bariloche model is that it is a model about the world economy built from the bottom of the economy ladder, looking up, rather than the elitist model built from the pinnacles of the Cambridges, Massachusetts, or England, looking down or into the future at world problems. This perspective gives the model a ring of authenticity, whereas world dynamics and the limits of growth struck many as basically computer games. The Bariloche model was finally come to grips with the concrete problems of mankind. It is interesting that in so doing, they have combined a radical political philosophy with a traditional set of techniques. So meanwhile, what happened in Peru? And in Peru, I think they started with the revolutionary government, revolutionary government of the armed force, which was a peculiar government. They overthrew the president in 1968, who was Fernando Belaunde, and they intended to bring a deep social and economic reforms in Peru. It was a particular type of military government which operated under a sort of, even if they denied it, it was a sort of socialist ideology, quite the opposite to the rest of military regimes at the time in Latin America. And among some of its most important reforms, this government expropriated and nationalized oil companies, decreed an extensive land reform, and they dissolved all factories, plantations, in an intent to turn the semi-feudal rural model of Peru into a modern collection of agrarian and cooperatives and lots of different models built on cooperative enterprises. So, but there was a problem. I mean, they were moving fast, but they didn't have the capacity to evaluate the impact of the reforms. And when I read this quote from Juan Velasco Alvarado, the leader of this military junta, I think they didn't reckon that they were thinking of a cybernetic approach. I mean, just by reading this, I think it's clear. We aspire to an economic order in which ownership and control of decisions gradually comes to be in the hands of all those involved in the production process, through increasing state support for forms of social ownership of the means of production and the organization of institutions that give the traditionally marginalized sectors of a real economy autonomy that is ever greater and capable of guaranteeing their fruitful and creative participation in national decisions. So this is a powerful statement, because what Velasco was trying to do was to lead Peru towards a modernization, but not according to Western modes of production and consumption, but by radically introducing new arrangements that put the satisfaction of human needs and well-being at the center, which means not only economic prosperity, but had a much greater and original ideals, which he called for a creative and active participation of the people in formulating and setting up this new society. So what they proposed was a kind of feedback infrastructure, I could say, some that could use to pinpoint social problems and facilitate the deliberation, presenting different conceptual approaches to the issues involved and involving many peoples that were usually excluded. And this framework would suggest that through certain democratic procedures based on participation, new modes of problem solving and means of social coordination. But there was therefore an even greater challenge, and Velasco's government did not just want to control and manage the economy, but also to create a model in which people could decide their future and actively participate. So this is how, in a way, Darcy Ribeiro became engaged. He was, in a way, surprised and fascinated by the military government, and he was invited to work on the educational reform, the higher educational reform in Peru for a while he was in Chile, and he had some meetings with some members of this government, and he built this memo. This is a memo written by Darcy and also by Oscar Barsavsky for the government authorities, and it is mentioned that they could build a sort of a model which could be built in 6 to 10 months, and that it was it could have a sort of potential to be an instrument for decision making. So, I mean, it added the integration and compatibility of plans, programs, and goals of the group responsible for defining government policy, and the model is a sort of clean representation of data and a hypothesis used by policymakers to make their decisions. It had an integrated basic numerical information set of information, a data bank, let's say, a database on the population, on society, on Peruvian economy, and a sort of verification of the feasibility of likely effects on different sectors of social life. So the greatest utility of the model was not necessarily to project, but to describe and quantify what Peru could be as a society and as an economy in, let's say, 10 or 20 years' times, through not just economy-based rewards, but also moral. I mean, finding new ways of social welfare in the population. At that time, the government of Peru also established another organization called CINAMOS. In this moment, Centro was not yet established, but they established this organization, which was a government agency designed to, let's say, help, support, and achieve these objectives. I mean, and it was organized it was a very complex organization. It was organized in 10 regions. It has lots of skills, but people coming from activism, from public engagement, knowledge of social science model. So, I mean, when I see these, I'm not gonna focus that much into CINAMOS. It's important because CINAMOS, in a way, was the organization that asked for support, and that's how the Centro became a reality. But if I see this structure, I think that the structure has also a little bit of a connection with the biosystem model, as it was intended to be functionally decentralized as an organization, but at the same time have cohesions depending on the different layers of the organization. So what happened is that in 1970, around 1970, the government requested the assistance to implement the project that will support CINAMOS. The project started in 1970, end of, let's say, mid-72, starting of 1973. It was called the Center for the Study of People's Participation, in short, Centro. Darcy Rivero was invited to lead the project. So initially, it was a place a space, an initiative to study strategies on social participation and cooperatives. That's how it started when the government requested this. They didn't know Darcy Rivero at that time, but when they met Darcy, and Darcy with Oscar Barsavsky came with all these ideas, they really radically expanded the idea of the project to create this database that included economic, political, social, and cultural data, and this aim of creating a comprehensive computational model of society. One of the things that I think it's important to mention is that Darcy was very struck by the fact that this group of military officers sought to carry out a social revolution and implement radical reforms in an attempt to reinvent the society, which was a bit of a contradictory and difficult in Peru, but also it was contradictory in terms of what was going on in Latin America. And he was interested in learning from that. And for Darcy Rivero, the idea of creating this research center in Peru was also to use it as a sort of pilot for the study, the methodological study of social policy planning for Latin America. So that is why it began to appeal to him, the idea of leading this project, and the idea to implement social and economic experiments, numerical experiments, in the form of using them for cooperatives and other productive and service sectors. For that to happen, Darcy called an interdisciplinary team of anthropologists, sociologists, economists, people that convene to formulate, evaluate, forecast the development of future effects. In this photo, you see Carlos Sena, but you also see other people that were part of the project. Many were from Latin America. Many were Latin American professionals that were escaping from their countries due to the increase of right-wing military coups, but also researchers from Europe and the United States. Experts in numerical experimentation, systems analysis, organizations, the organization of agricultural enterprises, of cooperatives, feasibility analysis consultants, people that understood the development of cooperative models or cooperative enterprises, of models like self and co-management models, of course, social research, but also including journalism and audiovisual practices, which he used. So initially, when he started the first ideas, and this was not what happened at the beginning, let's say it happened when it was implemented, but before that, when he envisioned the idea of Centro, he thought of a research unit, which initially was going to be led by Oscar Barsavsky, who would be in charge of two subunits, one around numerical experimentation program, and the other one on economic social studies. On this basis, the research unit proposed to elaborate through the use of the methodology of numerical experimentation and operational research, a global computational model of Peruvian society and the Peruvian economy that could in turn feed this into a database. So this model was to be used by the presidency to formulate, the presidency of Peru and the higher ranked staff, to formulate an integrated national project of autonomous, self-sustaining and development for all sectors of the population. So this in turn will allow for the development of programs that could support the cooperatives in their economy. At the end, that did not happen. In the research unit was focused on other aspects, on agricultural cooperatives, in the management of social interest enterprises, grassroots organizations, industrial economy, social property, indigenous communities, even shanty towns, which were developed. The first head of research was Stefano Varese, who I mentioned before. But I think it was interesting to see that the first vision around that was much more connected to numerical experimentation and modeling. Then there was a technical assistant unit, which would provide support in responding to the requests from the government bodies, to CINAMOS, for example. It would also be responsible for organizing methods of administration and management, as well as controlling the productivity and implementation of certain programs in these new enterprises, and to develop competencies to ensure their economic growth. That was another unit, and the other one was a training unit. And the training unit, provided access to social communication. They also had a very interesting publications program. It's interesting that they also planned, which didn't happen at the end, but they also planned an audiovisual laboratory. This emphasis on education was evident because the entire team of international experts will have specific obligations in teaching activities. That was also quite an interesting thing. So the experts had to dedicate some time into training or teaching activities. So to focus a little bit on the work of Barsavsky and the numerical experimentation. So Barsavsky model, the idea of the model proposed by Oscar Barsavsky is that it made possible to represent the development of, let's say, a political situation in an institution or organization at a given moment in time. It was called a poly model or political indicators. And he stated that the complexity of the variables, interactions, and hypotheses to be handled made it very difficult to formulate a verbal model, but quite on the contrary, a mathematical model on numerical experimentation is better adapted to the problems. And this is why it made so much sense to use a mathematical model. And what Polly tried to do is to simulate which alternative will be approved in a given political situation, either in a country or a region or specific institutions, given a correlation of forces and interests of different groups. So the model sets out the relationships between the actors and the framework in which they develop, receives input values for certain parameters and indicators that attempt to describe that reality. And if the model simulates a behavioral reality that may be reasonably correct, then it could be approved in a way, even though it might look as a fully deterministic situation. What it does is that it enables a space for discussion, for criticism, and hence variation. And this is therefore how the model was used as a tool that can contribute to the clarification of ideas, not of a projection of a desirable model based on the data, but on making sense of using numerical experimentation of possible models. So let's say in this case, power, which is mentioned here, could be divided into zones in order to better analyze the different types of power that are quite distinct. And there are also political forces normally comprising of small numbers of individuals in relation to the total population. And once more, here also there are specific classification that could be determined through economy, through cultural or other common interests. So the political indicators model analyzes which alternatives could be approved or could make more sense, bearing in mind that each political force will also support the alternative that gives it the most of the power. So each group may increase in a way the satisfaction of its needs. And they use part of these, at least from what I've been studying, in as pilots for the agrarian reform. So one of the main focuses was the conversion of these agro-industrial complexes into agrarian production cooperatives. There were so many problems there. There was an uneven development of, let's say, in this case, sugar production cooperatives. There was a lack of integration with the regional economy, and there are many problems. And these problems meant that there was a high concentration of economic power in some cooperatives and a sort of monopoly of sugar production, which was quite the contrary to what they aimed, and did not stimulate the production and the growth and the investment in the development of the industry. And therefore, due to the high degree of economic power, they also held abuse political power, and this was opposed to what they expected, which was a more cooperative model. And in order to find a solution to the problem, the probable effects and their potential dangers, and particularly political conflicts, they formulated this within the model. So the purpose was to think of economic, administrative, social, ideological, and political variables to be defined, and each of these variables were assigned a number, a weight, let's say. This is some of the calculations that were done, so that the numerical experimentation, in this case, the political model, was applied to the calculation of the political feasibility of the socioeconomic changes under consideration, in order to get a situational picture and listing the main issues, in this case, both in the enterprise, but also externally. And in this way, the interesting thing is that the long-term solution that were proposed based on the model were able to define development styles, which was something that Varsavsky proposed, and alluded to an analysis of different possible futures through a constructive but also political method. And in this way, the proposals on population distribution, the degree of productive autonomy, the scarcity of resources at national or regional level could be defined. No? And based on the possible future, it was also possible to determine these a sort of medium-term actions that could have a direct impact also in the long-term objectives. And this was very useful for the politicians, for the government, for the decision making, even though these were pilot projects. This was let's say the contribution of Oscar Barsavsky, but I would say that in addition to Barsavsky models, the influence of Stafford Beer was also put forward in mostly thanks to Carlos Sena, who has worked previously at Cinco in Chile for 9 months before the Pinochet military coup. And in several documents, in Centro there is a preliminary project for the creation of a real-time enterprise information and control system that was published in 1974. And the idea of the real-time control system figures prominently, as we know in the Cinco project in Chile, where of course they use this telex network to achieve this close to real-time control. But in the case of Peru, the Peruvian case, the creation of the social property sector prompted the need to create mechanisms for participation in enterprise to guarantee decision-making and autonomy at all levels. So the development of an information and control system was proposed as a tool to achieve such autonomy in the enterprises. And to this end, Centro proposed the creation of a study group to investigate and implement such instrument. There are parts of the document that are specifically talking about this. Throughout the document, there is much emphasis on the topic on how the project seeks to ensure the autonomy of decision making that is generated by the mechanisms of participation, at the same time levels of management of the productive apparatus, which means that they saw that the information and control systems as management mechanisms of, let's say, that use some of the principles of scientific administration, of general system theory, some concepts on cybernetics. So the documents that I've been looking at, they explain some of these concepts. And once more, they are preliminary aspects in which they mention some of the ideas of Stafford Beer, who proposed to implant the real-time nervous systems in the economy under the principles of continuous adaptation, a system which employs the computer as a logical engine and not merely as a data repository. So these are very much the thoughts of Stafford Beer that were written in his book on his book Brain of the Firm. And this is not the only mention to Stafford Beer and the Cinco project. Carlos Sena also organized a presentation of the project for a group of high-ranked military officials, and it is quite possible that the first text, or one of the first texts that was published around the Cinco project was published by Centro in 1974 in this book on planning and participation. I mean, in this essay, you can see there were some, I mean, it's clearly explained the experience of the Cinco project with throughout a detailed explanation of Stafford Beer's viable system model, and including some illustration, flowcharts, but also an image of the emblematic operations room designed by Gibbon Siepe. And interestingly, this publication ran 5,000 copies, one of the highest of those that were identified within the central publication. This is not the only publication on the subject. Carlos Sena also participated in other publications with articles on management systems and cooperative enterprises, which discuss in depth the use of computers. So Unfortunately, the project ended in 1976. The government of Peru was not interested in keeping that, and this was due to the failing health of General Juan Velasco, who followed the amputation of his leg in 1973 and weakened the government, and ended in an institutional military coup of another general who took over, which meant that CINAMOS, the agency, this government agency, was progressively dismantled, and so was Centro. And at that time, Darcy Ribeiro's health was also, he also had some health problems. He undergo a surgery in Brazil. So he had also to be away of Centro for 6 months. So, I mean, there were a lot of unfortunate events that happened. Unfortunately, also that very same year, Oscar Barsavsky passed away. So as a way of conclusion, I think it should be stressed that an important contribution of Centro was how this group of professionals could support the work of CINAMOS, how this group of professionals, intellectuals could provide support on various fronts, offering expertise in areas ranging from numerical analysis and operational research to management. And this allowed a very original look at the mobilization and the popular participation through training and assistance, and also research. And despite that, Darcy Ribeiro and Oscar Barsavsky's expectations for creating this cybernetic socialist model for Peru, it is possible, if we compare it to what happened with Chile, that the people, that their interlocutors, the people that they spoke with at the high command militaries, failed to understand the relevance of the model and how it could help social participation. And as a result, even though it was supported by CINAMOS, it was not sufficiently supported, or it was not given the priority. So there were other immediate priorities that they had to work on. In Chile, as I was mentioned, when Stafford Beer presented the viable system model to Salvador Allende, who was a medical doctor, he understood it perfectly in terms of neuroscience and identified the potential to generate a model for people's participation. So I would just like to conclude saying that the radical ideas of Darcy Ribeiro, of Oscar Barsavsky, and Stafford Beer suggests that a different way of understanding society is possible. And in a world that is becoming more complex, yet more intolerant, we need to create new possibilities that do not depend on markets or on techno-deterministic or algorithmics or AI models born in Silicon Valley. We need to use the tools and ideas of cybernetics, or this type of cybernetics, so original, to create new institutions and hence a better society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Carlos, for a really inspiring presentation. I would like to invite everyone to comment. I'm sure that there will be lots of interesting questions. Alfredo, yes.
Thank you very much. Jose Carlos, fascinating your presentation. I really would like to get to know more. Just one small question. I met those years somebody who, to put the question more clearly, what kind of relationship did Barsavsky have with CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America?
Yeah. I mean, he worked for.
Sorry, let me complete the question. Just that, because I at the time was finishing my career in my studies in engineering in Chile. I was an assistant to an economist who worked at CEPAL, who was Pedro Sainz, and I understand. And he asked me sometime to check those boxes with the cards which you loaded the computer at those times. they were running a model, precisely this numerican experimentation model. So my specific question is, were they applying or intending to apply in Peru the same model that they were running in CEPAL? Was it different? Were the same people there? This is my question.
I mean, I cannot have a specific answer to that. I mean, the thing with CEPAL is that in a way this model was a critique to the CEPAL model, which was based mostly on economics and how to drive social welfare from more of an socioeconomic perspective. This was a very radical view of that. Nevertheless, it's true that through Eric Calcaño, but other people, but Varsavsky was involved, especially with the CEPAL in Buenos Aires. So there was a project which was a model of numeric experimentation to analyze, let's say, economic policies, alternative economic policies in the long term, which was developed by Oscar Varsavsky for the office of CEPAL in Buenos Aires. So, I mean, there was a connection with CEPAL and Varsavsky for sure, and Eric Calcaño worked a lot on several articles with Varsavsky. Actually, Eric Calcaño is still living. He lives in Buenos Aires.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I can share. I have well, I was researching on CEPAL. It's interesting. Most of the CEPAL documents are available online, and I was researching, and there are lots of documents or certain documents around Varsavsky. I'm putting in the chat one of them, which is the one that I already mentioned.
Carlos, please.
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good. How it all started? Well, it started when Oscar was in Venezuela and met Holland. Holland was a mathematician, American mathematician, who was doing with the Venezuelans the application of a model for the Indian economy. He was showing how useful it would be to apply to the petrol sector in Venezuela something he did in India. And Varsavsky saw it, knew the model of Holland, and saw the potentiality, the political potentiality of this method. So the seeds of the numeric experimentation were in Holland's model, applied in India and then in Venezuela for the petrol sector. So what did Oscar what he did was to enhance this model. So he enhanced it, making it possible to dream and to calculate the feasibility of a dream. That is, it's not sufficient to dream about the future of our country. Rather, we need to calculate its feasibility. It's not enough to design the future Peru, but to calculate whether or not it's feasible. So what Oscar did was to establish, through this mathematical modeling, the calculation of 3 levels of feasibility. First one, the physical feasibility of the model. Are the resources enough? Are the human resources enough? Are the factories and so forth and the producing structure enough to carry out during the time and achieve the desired society in 10, 20, 30 years? Well, let's say yes, the model is physically feasible. Then another level of feasibility analysis should be carried out, which is the social feasibility. Are the social mechanisms and income and richness and wealth enough for distributing riches and applying and allocating the resources to make it feasible? Yes or no? And after that, are the political forces strong enough to stop it and to avoid this? So a political feasibility analysis should be carried out. There are 3 levels of analysis in this feasibility investigation: the physical feasibility, the social feasibility, and the political feasibility. What we did in Peru, and the model was always, I answered Alfredo Del Valle question, the model was in constant evolution. Oscar never stops to improve the model. I remember talking to Jose Carlos recently, that Oscar came one day in the center and said, I need an indicator for insecurity. Well, the next day I did the indicator and formulated, gave it to Oscar, and Oscar said, no, this is not good, not at all, because I need an indicator for the insecurity from the individual point of view, not an objective one. So what I will do, said Oscar immediately, is the spread of risk. The spread of risk will be our indicator for insecurity. And he put it in the model. So the model was in constant evolution. It never stopped. It would be much enhanced nowadays if Oscar were with us still now. So this is, and in Peru, when I arrived in Peru the very morning of the coup d'etat in Chile. I took the last plane, the very last one. When I came, I met Darcy, the center was there, and the people in Centro in Senamo said, what did you do? What they did in Chile? Tell us about this Cinco project. We're very much interested in it. I had a meeting with the military in Peru. They said nothing because they were very much, how to say, not so much open-minded in had relations with civilians and foreigners and so forth. Very discreet they were. And after that, in the Centro, they asked me to make a seminar describing the system in Chile. Well, that was very good because I wanted to spread the gospel. I want to do it again. I want to call the Chileans who are all over the world splashed by the coup d'etat of Pinochet and bring them to Peru, perhaps, and maintain the idea alive. So I did this chapter for this book on planning, aiming that we could do something afterwards. We never did because the urgencies in Peru were of other nature. That's what I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Raúl, you are muted, Raúl. You need to unmute. You are still muted. Apologies that I muted everyone earlier because there was some noises. Okay, now you are right.
It's going to be all right. Now it's going to be all right. Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the North and South are very well divided in this room. I can see people who are suffering the cold, bad weather of the North at the same time that others are enjoying beautiful sunshine and warm weather and all the rest. So congratulations to those. I think sometime it will come. In the middle of that is our friend Carlos. Carlos from Rio has both things. So Carlos has very extraordinary connections with what happened in Chile and what happened in Peru, and we have kept interactions all the time. So it's clear that he is one of those who can distribute the knowledge that we created and developed in Chile throughout the world. So thank you, Carlos, for bringing all this, and thank you, Jose Carlos, for bringing all the knowledge about Peru and Argentina that you have. One thing that I wanted to mention is, are you aware of one thing that I would have expected Jose Carlos to explain and develop was the idea of the Euroceiv model in Uruguay.
Yeah.
I think Euroceiv, in my view, was an extraordinary follow-up of the project in Chile.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry that you didn't mention that. In fact, I am going to bring something more to this. Are you aware of this book?
Not that one, but I know not that one, not Pedesiva, no.
Pedesiva. This is a book written by the same author of the Euroceiv
Yes.
book.
Yeah, that one I do have, the one that is called No Hay Gato, I think.
Exacto.
Yeah.
No hay gato.
Yeah.
But Victor Ganon is someone who has done an extraordinary contribution to science, technology, and management in Uruguay.
Yeah.
This book is, as it says, Los orígenes de una revolución científica y cultural en el Uruguay post-dictadura. So this is the origins of a scientific revolution and cultural revolution in Uruguay after the dictatorship.
Yeah.
And I certainly would recommend to everybody to find out this book, because it explains something that is very unique to Uruguay, and that is the development of science and technology in areas like biology, like mathematics, like physics, all the main developments of science, which were somehow supported by institutional developments in Uruguay, and in particular by the president of Uruguay.
Yeah, Julio Maria Sanguinetti, yes.
Sanguinetti.
Yeah.
So this is something that when we talk about science, we talk about technology, we talk about government and governance. I think that all of us who were connected to this work in Latin America, we need to get that into our attention and do something with it.
Yeah. May I say a couple of things? Thank you for your comments, Raul. I would say that definitely I thought about Euroceiv, but the thing with Euroceiv is that it was after 1985, and the focus of this research is mostly the 70s. However, as a follow-up discussion, definitely Euroceiv sits in a very interesting connection with Centro and also with Cinco. With Cinco, because Stafford Beer collaborated in the project. I think he traveled in 1986.
And in fact, Elena Leonard was part of that project as well.
Yeah, but there was also something that repeats in the narrative around these projects, was that these sort of let's say control room, or at least these tools should be made available mostly for the higher ranks of the government. And this is something that is continuous. It happens with Centro, at least in the first documents that I found. What it meant is that these tools should be used by the staff of the presidency of the government of Peru. And a little bit is what happened also with Euroceiv in a way, and in a way with the idea of the ops room in Cinco, no? But Yeah, I mean, this is something that comes to my mind when I was researching on the project on Centro, for sure. So it's more like a post story, but definitely it's something that is very much connected.
Exactly so, Jose Carlos. It is very, very much connected in that all that they have been and they did after 1986 was something that had its strength in what happened in Chile, and at the same time they started to learn.
But I found something related. Do you want?
So we have someone needs to mute herself.
Right.
I think it's okay now.
So they had at the same time that they had they started to develop some understanding of what happened in Chile. And that is perhaps the point where I wouldn't put what Uruguay was or is today, because what is extraordinary is that this PDCVA is still working, is still part of the institutional setup of Uruguay. It is still supporting the science and technology and governance in Uruguay. So in that sense, there is no separation, I would say. Clearly, they learned, the Uruguayans learned a good deal. And I would love to hear Elena to tell us more about what happened when she was there, because she was part of the Uruguayan project. And then what comes clear, as I read this book recently, comes clear to me is that they did learn from us. They did learn from the work we did in several parts, in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina. So I think this is a very interesting project, and thank you, Carlos, for bringing it to our attention today. So that's all I want to say for the time being.
Elena, you're muted. Yeah, that's all right.
Okay. It was very interesting being there. Essentially, we were there for a couple or 3 weeks, 3 times under a UNDP grant. And it was tied to the implementation of computer access. And they kind of added it on. It was it was possible to see some things. One thing that happened quite quickly was the development of a quantified flow chart to determine under what conditions it was better for Uruguay to import.
The connection is broken, Elena. We'll have to wait for you.
And
We couldn't hear you, the last sentence. Can you repeat what you were saying, Elena? Because we have a breakout in your connection.
I said that the UNDP project was put under the umbrella of a computer implementation project. And one of the outcomes that happened quite quickly was a quantified flow chart that enabled the Uruguayan government to determine under what conditions it was preferable to buy oil on the open market in a cruder or a more refined form. And while we were there, they decided that under those circumstances, it cost them more money to refine it in Uruguay than it cost them, than the extra cost of buying the more refined oil. But that was something that they were going to keep looking at. One thing that we had hoped to do, and I'm not sure if how much of it got implemented, was to roll the project out into the intendencias so that the local the local areas would be able to use this locally in their assessment of their needs and capabilities. Unfortunately, I don't read Spanish, so I haven't been able to read Victor's book. I'm hoping that it'll get translated into English. But it might be interesting to invite Victor to present at Metaforum sometime, and essentially give it to us from the horse's mouth. He does speak very good English, having studied in an English-speaking country for university.
Well, that sounds like a really good idea. We should do it, Elena, definitely.
I just want to mention that Victor introduced the Argentinians into this, into Eurociv and into Cinco. And several of you triggered that, Elena, with naming the people from the intendencias and people from the immediate lower level in the structure of the Argentinian government. But they were, and they signed a contract with Uruguay to bring some of the work that Eurociv had developed in Uruguay to take it into Argentina. So there is plenty there that can be of great interest and value for us at this stage.
I wanted to ask a question to both, to Jose Carlos and Carlos, Sena, and Raul. And it's a question, I mean, I'm very curious about these coincidences between the way that the project, the Centro project evolved in Peru and the CyberSyn project evolved in Chile nearly simultaneously, and the influence that it had later in Uruguay and Argentina, and of course, Colombia. We have talked about that before. So, Raul, first, what do you think? What is it in Latin America?
Look, Carlos answered that.
Yeah, well, okay, but the
because
question is,
because the day after he left Chile,
yeah,
he was already
in Peru. Yes,
introducing all these ideas, which
yes,
led to Central.
Yes, I understand that, and I understand that Carlos was a very important character in disseminating the CyberSyn project in Peru and the impact that it had in the ideas from Centro. But my question is more generic. I just wonder what was going on in Latin America 50 years ago that allowed this context for the emergence of these ideas that were completely pioneering in these days in the world. And Latin Americans were the first one who jumped into implementation. Carlos.
Before we give to Carlos the word, Angela, you know very much what happened. We did work in Colombia, and I think the fact that I haven't mentioned Colombia at this stage is just because we have plenty with all the south of South America. But you know very well that we did apply all these ideas which we relate to Cinco, CyberSyn, and Centro, and so on. We applied them to the Contraloría General de la República.
Yes, I did. I do know very well, and not only to the Contraloría. I mean, I did apply it to several big projects in Colombia in the 90s. So I know that in the 90s, there was a huge impact of cybernetics in Colombia. And that's related with all this that we are talking about. I'm just thinking about the context, the cultural context and the political context in Latin America that allowed this to happen at that moment in time, and the consequences. And the next question that is related, what do you think are the consequences that nowadays, 50 years later, these ideas and these projects may still have resonance in something of what is happening currently in Latin America?
I think, Carlos, perhaps I'm not going to continue, but I understand your point, Angela.
Okay, Carlos.
Well, may I say, what happened in Latin America in the 70s was democracy. And as I dare to say in the paper, Jose Carlos showed initially, I dare to compare Chile, Allende's Chile, with Pericles' Greece, due to the strong blooming of creativity in those places. And the reason for it was democracy. So what uncaged these beautiful birds was democracy. This is the reason why, yes. Now, I also wish to state something that I think Raul talked about the steering of the NUMEX model, the steering of the numeric experimentation model. Of course, we did it for government, because the Peruvian government and the United Nations were financing the job. But what Oscar wished was that governments should apply it, shadow cabinets should apply it, political movements should apply it to strengthen their actions and to debilitate the actions of their adversaries. Because when you show proof mathematically that the project, a national project, is feasible, and your enemy's national project is not, because it's not feasible, then this is strengthen your political position. So what Oscar thought was that this could be applied by political movements, by the militancy. He was very radical in this aspect, was not at all scientificist. This is what I wish to add to this conversation.
This is really, really interesting. And the second question, Carlos, perhaps you can also answer the second question, that is, what do you think that has been the consequences of this background, these historical projects in the current history of Latin America? Because we are in a turning point in Latin America, and in a way, we're going backwards in time. And it will be really nice to see your feelings about what's left there that is now beginning to be rebirthed.
Well, we had dreadful times in Latin America after those experiments. We had fascism everywhere, in Brazil, in Chile, and so forth. And now there is sort of a rebirth of democracy. So opportunities pop up for us to apply. Now we have, so if we follow Varsavsky's ideas of applying those models in the militancy, you have the Indians movements, you have women's movements, you have landless people movements. They all could use these instruments to evaluate the feasibility of their ideas or their projects. So, and the national project, as far as Oscar stated, shouldn't be something quite general as freedom, liberty, equality, and so forth. No, it should be stated in terms of popular needs, physical needs, cultural needs, political needs, and so forth. And for example, housing. Is our project good enough to provide housing for the Peruvian people in 20 years? Not poor houses, but decent houses. Is it feasible to do that? Together with education, all the kids sitting in the schools, is our project good enough to provide physical education for all the students in Peru? All the needs should be taken together in these studies, mathematical studies. If this is feasible physically, then we study the social feasibility and the political feasibility and so forth. The poly model shown by Jose Carlos was something done because the political situation in that local and specific situation was a political problem. So we applied this model. We were applying the NUMEX model, the numerical experimentation model in national level for the whole country. And you apply the poly model, the political model for the sugar cooperatives, because the situation there was to study the political feasibility of a change. So we used the instrument over there. We took it and used it. Moreover, I wish to state, remember, before I forget, that Oscar was a supernova. He was always creating things. He expanded the model. He expanded his contribution to science and technology. And I wish to remember the proposals he did for selection of technology from socialist perspective. Not any national project is compatible to any technology. Technology should be coherent with the national project. So he enlisted criteria for the selection of technology associated to each project, particularly for the national creative socialist project, which he cared about. So the selection of technology was something embedded in these models as well.
Thank you, Carlos. John Waters have a question, and then Raul. Yep.
Yes, just quickly. I found that really fascinating. And I think I've learned a lot today, if it has sunk in. But now I want to learn more. And I'm wondering if this work has been continued by anyone in the light of more recent knowledge, whether any kind of synthesis has been produced. And what else can I read?
Well,
My understanding of Spanish is limited. I can go through with a dictionary, and I'm also very lazy.
Well, there are all these papers that it was a lot of effort to put all these papers on the history of cybernetics together. I would say that the introduction to that special issue, we took a lot of time, not just to build a coherent narrative, but also adding other cases that were not spotted in the contributions, like cybernetics in Cuba, for example, which also there was an interesting couple of publications around cybernetics in Cuba in the I think in the late 60s or early 70s. So I would recommend you to read the introduction of that special issue first.
Can you share that?
Yeah, I can share it. I can share it on the chat. Yes.
The special issue is artificial intelligence and society, which was edited with two others by Jose Carlos, and I think it was a very, very valuable contribution. It took a long time, as Jose Carlos remembered, to get all these papers together. But that is, in my view, what is staying after all this time. All these publications that came afterwards are incredibly valuable.
And I'm also putting the link of the whole pack of publications if somebody wants to take a look at them, which is the second link. But I mean, that's I think that has also prompted I think we think that there are other original projects that need to be visible, like the case of Centro, even though it's mentioned in Carlos' inspiring testimony and paper in AI and Society. I mean, I thought it was so much sense to discuss a little bit more on that, because once more, Darcy is a person that comes from social science, and bringing Darcy Ribeiro and Oscar Barsavsky together, I think that was explosive. And at the same time, it's interesting that this came from Latin America, as in the case of the Fundación Bariloche. That's why I also brought up the issue of Fundación Bariloche. I mean, there are other connections that I didn't mention, but the head of the Latin American world model at Fundación Bariloche, Amilcar Herrera, worked with Oscar Barsavsky and Darcy Ribeiro in a document around the future of higher education in Peru before Centro. So there are lots of relations that I didn't mention today because it demands more time and a little bit diverges the story that I wanted to tell. But there were many other connections, or the relation between Darcy Ribeiro and Manuel Sadowski. Manuel Sadowski was the father of computation both in Argentina and Uruguay. He established the first computer centers in both countries. So there are many connections around these people, but once more, Darcy Ribeiro was present in this. I think that Carlos stated it clearly. He was also present in these two, perhaps the most important socialist project experiments in the 70s in Latin America, Allende in Chile, Velasco in Peru, and therefore, I mean, they had great expectation that these models could bring an original proposal based on the peculiarities of Latin America, and that's why it's interesting, because Darcy Ribeiro was not only an intellectual, he was also a man of action, and I think that this also states a little bit his ideas. When Darcy Ribeiro talked about utopias, he did not necessarily had only this idea of something that is not feasible, but actually he linked that to a potential feasible project. And the idea of utopia was to imagine new models of welfare in Latin America. And this makes us to rethink a little bit also a series of concepts from Latin America when we are confronted to cybernetics, which I think that are quite interesting, no?
Well, thank you very much, Jose Carlos. This has been a really interesting and exciting conversation. I think that most of us are still avid of going deeper and understanding a little bit more the topic. So Alena's suggestion to bring Victor Ganon is very welcome. We'll make it happen. And I will invite all of you, if you have ideas on how to continue this conversation. I think that it is a very important conversation. We no doubt Latin America has been a nursery for cybernetic ideas, and a very important one. And I think that we have all lots of questions. I am particularly interested in finding out what of these seeds that some of you, us seeded in Latin America 50 years ago, 20 years ago, have been continue growing, and what are examples that in this moment we can reconnect with in Latin America and in the world about the applications of these ideas in politics and at the national level in development issues. It's really fascinating, and I would like very much to continue this conversation. Lots of things to learn. So thank you very much, Jose Carlos, Raul, Alena, for sharing your experiences, and hopefully we will continue this sooner than later. We will publish, Jose Carlos has kindly given me a link to his paper and to his presentation. So if anyone wants the link, just send me drop me an email and we will share it with you, okay? So thank you very much. We have another webinar. We have a second webinar this week, and is related, not unrelated to this one. Mike Jackson has asked me to offer him the opportunity to present his most recent work that is about Stafford Beer and the ideas, the original ideas from the Russian original cyberneticians, and the inspiration that it has had for him. So we will have him reflecting on his paper in Systems Research and Behavioral Sciences next week at the same time, same channels, same time. So looking forward to see you again next Wednesday. All the information is in the webpage and details about the Mike Jackson's webinar there. So hopefully we will continue this conversation and go deeper into the issue of applications of cybernetics in governance. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Fantastic session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Congratulations, Jose Carlos. Wonderful.
Thank you, Carlos. I mean, you've been pivotal for this research. So I'm always thankful about coming in contact with you and all your generosity.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I feel it. Me too. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.